like this, and believe me, Enid Blyton doesn't write my scripts. We are professionals. Oh yes, the mortgage man, the accountant, the solicitor, the high-flying salesman who gives away the carriage clock, they're all fine. But what do they do for widows and orphans? What do they do for companies and partnerships whose lives hang on a heartbeat?
Terence O'Halloran, typically impassioned, talking to a conference of insurance and investment professionals.
George, Miriam, Ian, Nancy, they all testify to you today that even your best efforts cannot be enough.
All people Terry knew who died young.
It is our duty to protect those people who die too soon, who live too long, and who become disabled. Wear your life insurance badge with pride. I still say, I sell life insurance.
I never met a man who wore so many hats as Terry. Life insurance expert, chartered insurance practitioner. He played national roles in organisations representing these fields. Pensions advisor for 30 years for the Federation of Small Business. Businessman running O'Halloran & Co. Author and publisher, he wrote 9 books, or was it 10? President at one time of the Lincolnshire Chamber of Commerce. Roundtabler and Rotarian, Breakfast Club organiser. If all this sounds a little serious, don't forget that Terry was happy to dress as a chicken at charity events for his Bailgate Rotary Club in Lincoln. Or maybe a pumpkin. Campaigner and activist, Terry was fearless and would take on anyone if he scented injustice. Car park operators, local authorities, civil servants, and of course politicians, all got a tongue-lashing. When the post office wanted to close his village post office, part of a national programme of closures, Terry went into overdrive.
Where else are we going to buy things? Like newspapers, groceries. Oh, stamps.
Postal orders.
Postal orders.
Old age pensions. Dole checks.
Seriously? Well, this sort of stuff, good oratory. What do you think, madam? Isn't it a disgrace? I think it is. My goodness. Get yourself over here. Let's have some support. All 4 of you. No, it's important that we talk about these things. Post offices are important to local communities. No joke. They're closing over 1,000 shops which happen to be attached to, or have post offices attached to them. They talk about £99 million losses. 70 million of that is Crown post offices. Nothing to do with our little rural post office at all. And nothing to do with the survival of our shop. Our post office is viable. We were down at the government department this morning, the barrows to carry concrete blocks. We bricked up the front entrance because it's like talking to a brick wall. So we built one.
In his so-called retirement, he was owner and director of Multibus Limited, formed to spearhead his campaign for a cheaper method of converting buses and coaches to green energies. He revisited his engineering skills, first honed in the RAF, and came up with a new form of in-motion charging, a rework of the old trolleybus principles which would enable hybrid buses to charge up sufficiently in town and then go out on rural routes without the need for wires. Buses were part of Terry's story. As the only child of a single dad, he would wait at the bus stop in Hounslow, London, for his dad to come home from his business as a tailor in Carnaby Street. One night when Terry was 11, he went to the bus stop, but his dad wasn't on the bus. On arriving back home again, he found he had accidentally locked himself out. Young Terry went round to a neighbour. The neighbour took him in, but strangely decided to call the police. Terry ended up in a police cell because the police had nowhere else to put him. Years later, he would tell the story to business groups. Terry loved his dad to bits, but could now see that his dad, working far too many hours, wasn't charging enough for his skilled work and was too lenient about collecting payment. It spurred Terry to invent FeePack, a system to ensure the self-employed were properly remunerated, a theme he would return to frequently as a member of the Federation of Small Business Policy and Taxation Committee. Most important of all, Terry was a family man, married to Linda for over 50 years. He leaves 2 children, Matt and Sophie, and their partners, and 3 grandchildren, and an elderly mother-in-law. He knew how to have fun, great family fun. Phil Betts will now talk of Terry in the context of his RAF career and years of work for the Squadron Association, and then we'll play the programme.
Linda asked me to say a few words at Terry's funeral about his time in the Royal Air Force and his association with 31 Squadron and the association. I thought I'd like to share some of those words with you now. Terry joined the Royal Air Force in 1960. He was a bright-eyed 15-year-old, and he was posted first to RAF Halton in Aylesbury, where he trained as an airframes fitter, looking after the mechanical, non-electrical part of an aircraft. Once qualified, he was posted to RAF Wittering in 1963. 1966, Terry received what he would have said, and I would agree, was a prime posting to 31 Squadron in Germany at RAF Larbruck near the Dutch border. Terry served about 3 years with the Green and Gold, but became passionate about the squadron. During this period, Terry would have enjoyed the pleasures, and I use some poetic license there, of tachyvals and maxivals. Some of you may have memories of these and know what they were. For those of you who don't, they were exercises that were called to test the capability of a unit or a squadron should we transition to war. And they were generally called at no notice and could go on for a number of days, so you wouldn't know when they were going to end. Going back a step, yeah, you did hear me right. I did say Terry was in Germany in 1966, at the time when England won the Football World Cup. This is a fact that Terry loved to tell people again and again and again. Terry left the Royal Air Force in 1971, where he went on to enjoy a career in finance and insurance. And this is when Terry joined 31 Squadron Association, which is the longest all-ranks association that the Royal Air Force has. And this is when he discovered his passion for the squadron's history in Asia and the Indian subcontinent. I was going to say that Terry's full-time occupation was in the financial sector, and he spent his spare time keeping the squadron history alive. However, as many of you know, especially Linda, Terry pursued everything with a passion, and it was probably more accurate to say that his full-time pastime was the squadron history, and his pastime full-time job was finance and insurance. Terry initially served on the Squadron Association as Deputy Curator to Arthur Watts. He also went on to be Curator, Historian, and served for a period of time as Vice Chair as well. Terry curated a vast collection of memorabilia, or produced or contributed to DVDs, books and social media content detailing 31's history from its beginnings in India through to its part in the relief of Kohima and support of the Chindits in Burma, and up to and including the 38 years of Tornado. All of this carried out with the passion and diligence that became Terry's hallmark. Royal Air Force Larbruck, where Terry had served, closed at the end of the Cold War as an RAF unit. However, local people, including but not only, Rod and Sidney Hawkins and Jins Kutcher helped to set up a museum to commemorate and record the history of RAF Larbrook at the old station. Terry was more than instrumental in moving the 31 Squadron display out to the museum, and what a mammoth task it was, transporting 3 large ISO containers full of memorabilia from Royal Air Force Scampton in Lincolnshire to Larbrook in Germany. And shall we say, health and safety may have taken a bit of a back step on this occasion, as Terry, with colleagues and 2 Polish movers, with a large crane lifting ISOs in a container in what was described as the worst lightning storm that Germany had seen in years. Large crane, lightning, health and safety, I'll leave you to ponder on that. But all in a day's work for Terry. Now, most of us like shopping. I myself have been known to nip out and buy the occasional bits and pieces without possibly telling my wife. But let's imagine this. Terry goes out shopping, comes home, says to Linda, bought a camera. She goes, oh, a camera, dear? That's nice. He goes, no, a Canberra. A Canberra PR7 aircraft, full size, not a model. I think we can only start to begin to imagine how the conversation went. However, moving on swiftly, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the squadron, the association had decided to present a gift. Now, after long deliberation, it was decided that an appropriate gift would be a memorial stone at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. Terry again was instrumental in the fundraising, design, construction and placing of the stone. It now sits in pride of place at the National Memorial Arboretum, and I've been to visit a number of times. Terry certainly went quite often to clean it and keep it pristine, and I would certainly commend the idea of a visit to anybody who has an interest in the Royal Air Force or 31 Squadron. Even whilst Terry was very ill, he was still focused on the history and curating and ensuring that projects were completed. And even when he was confined to his chair, I'd go and visit, and he would keep on at me about making sure projects were completed. Hence why I'm here now, completing this project. So Terry, yes, if you're listening, I did listen, I am here, and I am helping complete your last project. The squadron stood down when Tornado left service, and has been stood up again with RPAS at Waddington. RPAS, for those who are not aware, is the remotely piloted air system. The initially may refer to it as a drone. Please don't do that if you're speaking to 31 Squadron personnel. It's much more than a drone. Terry has worked with the new squadron to help ensure that relationship between the association and the squadron remained strong and carried on as it had done since its formation. And he's responsible for having helped build those relationships. The association honoured Terry with the Bolton Award. This is an award not given out often and only given to people who the association feels has delivered service above and beyond that would be expected of most people. So I'll finish that by saying on the 3rd of May 2025, 31 Squadron and 31 Squadron Association mourned the loss of a curator, a historian, a supporter and a friend. Per ardua Terry, blue skies.
Hello, I'm Terence O'Halloran, better known to my friends and colleagues as Terry. I served on 31 Squadron at RAF Larbruck in Germany, servicing Canberra PR7s as an airframe fitter. I joined 31 Squadron RAF Association when I was in my early 30s after demob from the Air Force. And I spent the next 30 plus years in close association with my contemporaries, both air and ground crew from the Second World War, most of them now sadly deceased. I was Deputy Curator in those early days to Arthur Watts, AC Watts, a corporal electrician, would you believe. Arthur was a very keen curator and I learnt a lot from him. Arthur was a corporal electrician, as I've said, on 31 Squadron from 1941 through to 1946, a most diligent squadron historian. In the late 1970s, I compiled, edited and published First in the Indian Skies through Life Publications Limited in conjunction with author Norman Franks, who did a fantastic job researching and writing the text. This presentation tells the story of what happened at Kohima, from the experience of the veterans who fought there and the build-up to it. Kohima nestles in the heart of Nagaland, in the very northeastern corner of the Indian subcontinent. Southeast Asia was being overrun by the Japanese military. The siege of Kohima created a major turning point in the Japanese advance. The lifting of the siege started a full rout of the Japanese forces over the whole northeast India-Burma front. It is important to understand Japan's motivation. The Japanese had invaded China in 1937 and by 1941 occupied 2/3 of that country, including the industrial lowlands, and were pushing north and west into northern China to consolidate their gain. Japan was intent on closing the American supply route of military arms through Burma. Chiang Kai-shek was the president of what was left of China. However, he conflicted internally with Mao Zedong, the communist revolutionary within that northern Chinese territory. America was supplying China with materials to help the Chinese fight the Japanese aggressor. During the summer of 1941, 3 fighter squadrons of American volunteers were training at Tonggu in mid-Burma, eventually to go into China and assist in its defence. It was that explicit support that aggrieved the Japanese. So, on the 8th of December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor to neutralise its aircraft carrier fleet. From February 1942, Japan's offensive in Burma began in earnest to close that back door into China. That was possible following the fall of Singapore. We start mid-1943 and follow through to mid-1944. They marked the concerted Japanese invasion of India and the Allied response. There is much to learn today from what happened then. This long line of Douglas C-47 Dakota aircraft at Agatala in 1943 forms the focus of my address. It is the fundamental element of the story that will unfold. My intention is to create an understanding of the position in a theatre of war which stretched more than 800 miles north from the Bay of Bengal to Kohima. Now that exceeds the 669-mile length of Britain, Land's End to John O'Groats, and 600 miles from northeast India across Burma as an area of air supply operations. In May 1943, around the start of the 4-month monsoon season, Chiang Kai-shek was working with Brigadier General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, the US General in command of the American forces operating on the border north of Nagaland in northeast India. Stilwell's objective was to support the Chinese army and supply arms, munitions and mainly fuel into China by air, following the Japanese advance, sealing off the West Burma Lashio Road to Kunming in China, thus impeding the Americans' land supply route of arms to the Chinese. America's aircraft would also now bring Chinese army recruits to India for military training by British military personnel on their return flight from China over the hump. It is worth mentioning ghoulie chits, which have been around since 1916. They were essential passports from possible capture back to an individual's unit in the original dry desert environment of the northwest frontier region of India. Initially, they were issued as a paper document. The paper document was supplanted by a silk fabric successor for jungle application. Neither paper nor linen lasted very long in the damp northeast India-Burma climate. Through the ghoulie chit, local tribes were encouraged to assist military personnel returning to the Allied lines. Maps were also made of silk material for longevity. To the American military, a red circular marking on an aircraft meant that it was Japanese. Red was therefore removed from all Southeast Asia RAF aircraft paintwork after a few unnerving events. Dark blue roundels with a light blue centre helped avoid further mishap and became standard from April 1943 until the end of the Southeast Asia War, although 31 Squadron retained theirs until December 1946, but that's another story. Wingate's first 1943 long-range penetration expeditionary force, better known as the Chindits, with an embedded RAF liaison officer, relied entirely on being provisioned by air. These were dangerous and precise missions for all parties. The RAF units involved were 31 Squadron Dakotas, together with 194 Squadron Hudson bombers modified for supply duties. Unfortunately, the Hudson could not fly slow enough to be effective. Often parachutes would Roman candle, where the outside would invert the parachute and render it ineffective, like an umbrella in a strong wind. A poem by a serviceman at the time sets the scene, perhaps. It's entitled Airman's Grace. Lord of thunderhead in the sky, who placed in man the will to fly, who taught his hand speed, skill and grace to soar beyond man's dwelling place. You shared with him an eagle's view, the right to fly as eagles do, the right to call the clouds his home, and grateful through your heavens roam. May we, assembled here tonight, and all who love the thrill of flight, recall with twofold gratitude your gift of wings, your gift of food. We can all say amen to that, I'm sure. As we shall come to appreciate, the demands on the transport squadrons were immense and growing. To the extreme north, the operation known as the Hump, primarily flown by American pilots, operated from the Brahmaputra lowlands down to Mishinar, then on to Kunming, or other airfields in China, avoiding the higher Himalayan mountains. Mishinar was also a railhead linked to Rangoon. Its loss to the Japanese in May 1942 was more than significant for the American endeavours to supply the Chinese. The supply flights into China had to fly further north on a route taking them over the Himalayas at heights of up to 15,000 feet. 31 Squadron, with a few modified aircraft to accommodate oxygen for the aircrew, started on the inaugural flights. Mike Vlasto and Mac McLaughlin were in the vanguard of this operation, 525 miles from Dinjan in the Brahmaputra Basin at sea level through to Kunming at 6,000 feet in China. The Dakota engines on the aircraft involved were modified. They were fitted with twin boosters to provide the extra power required to achieve the task to fly to 7,000 feet in 15 minutes from takeoff at Dinjan airfield, fully laden, in order to climb above the initial mountain range. Now, at the same time, other Dakotas were involved in an entirely different type of operation. Lummy Lord, a new pilot, was asked to land in a jungle clearing to evacuate a number of wounded Chindits whilst on a supply mission. Having dropped the supplies, he returned to base. The strip suggested was just too short. After discussion with Bill Burberry, his CO, and a radio conversation with the embedded RAF liaison personnel, a suitable 800-yard strip was carved out of the jungle by the Chindits and a hazardous landing made possible. Bear in mind, this is the equivalent of 6 and a bit rugby pitches end to end to land and take off over the goalposts at each end. It took 2 days before Mike Vlasto, with a Life magazine reporter on board, succeeded in landing on the area indicated. Appropriate photographs were taken showing the message on the ground laid out in parachute material, "Plane land here," and 17 casualties were flown out. Mike received the DFC in recognition of his outstanding accomplishment. That story and pictures appeared in the American press. PR was second nature to the Americans. Not so to the British. These obligatory missions were to become an enduring task as the war intensified and the supply chain to Imphal and supply dropping to Kohima were drawn into that requirement. There were just 4 transport squadrons available by this time, amounting to around 80 to 90 Dakota aircraft at any one time in early 1944. It was to prove insufficient. All of our aircraft were serviced in the open, which was not without excitement, as Les Sumption could testify as he dived into a monsoon ditch, chased by a Zero firing at him. Or Harry Ham, who survived being struck by lightning after 3 days in a coma.
I knew them both. The Japanese had all but obliterated our fighter and bomber forces during the 1942-43 advance through Burma. So recovery was going to be certain, but slow.
However, with the 1943 monsoon season out of the way, and with 148 new airfields having been constructed in India to accommodate the rapid growth of Allied air forces, improvement was taking place. The RAF squadrons were re-equipped with later edition fighters like the Spitfire Mark V, which was more than a match for the Oscar Zero fighters that the Japanese relied upon. Bituminized Hessian sheet runway carpets, known as Bit Hess, kept the dust down in the dry season and made mud acceptable during the monsoon. That allowed some airfields to become all-weather facilities despite the monsoon's 256 inches of rain in 4 months. On occasions, 12 inches an hour.
Just imagine working on an aeroplane or flying an aeroplane in that.
The Hurricane Mark I, which was almost obliterated during the Japanese advance in 1942, was ably replaced by the Hurry bomber and the rocket-armed ground attack aircraft of 20 Squadron, which also provided escorts for the Dakotas. They were ably assisted by Mustangs and Ventura and similar aircraft provided by the Americans, which replaced a lot of our obsolete aircraft, such as the Brewster Buffalo and Mohawk.
In Europe, the 4-engine bomber had taken over from the twin-engine Wellington and similar aircraft, and therefore they were free to come into the Southeast Asia conflict and provide some backup for the RAF and renewal of the RAF effort in Southeast Asia against the Japanese. The big test of our fighting capability came about 4 days before we were due to attack the Japanese in the Arakan area. They attacked us.
February 1944 witnessed the start of the Japanese attempt to break through the Allied defences in the Arakan. It was an endeavour to gain access to the Bay of Bengal and the ports that could supply Japanese troops from the sea on that west coast at the bottom of this map. We focused on the Chin Hills in the Assam region, situated east from the coast, above Chittagong and Agartala. The Japanese logistical supply situation in late 1943 was stretched to the limit.
they had to succeed. The first Japanese failure in their westward campaigns came with the Battle of the Admin Box. Now, the Admin Box was the site of the 7th Indian Division headquarters, which became surrounded and feared would be overrun. Supplies from the air by 31 and 62 Squadron Dakotas, with 194 Hudsons, escorted by Hurricanes of 20 Squadron, 5 Squadron and others. The defenders resisted the incoming forces. 3 squadrons of Spitfire 5s added their considerable advantage. 65 Japanese aircraft were destroyed or damaged at a cost of 3 Spitfires and several Hurricanes lost in the airborne encounters. The battle for air superiority evolved from this point. On the 8th of February, 12 Oscars attacked a formation of Dakotas. 134 Squadron scrambled to meet their assailants. Some DACs turned back, others, with a Hurricane escort, continued. 6 Squadron Indian Air Force provided reconnaissance. It's worth noting that the Indian Air Force fighter squadrons joined the fray to stop further Japanese support. Of the 30 Dakotas that set off, only 12 made it to the drop zone, and only 1 delivered its full cargo to the admin box. This was deemed not good enough by the man in command. A determined USAF General, General Auld, the overall Air Force commander, personally flew later in the day. Despite his aircraft sustaining damage from ground fire, his Dakota delivered its full load of stores. That inspired other aircrew to persevere. For 19 days, the 7th Indian Army Division was totally cut off from ground supply. Dakotas maintained the supply of food, arms and ammunition in difficult mountainous terrain, whilst the Japanese army was starved of all three. 81 Squadron Spitfires joined the battle from Ramo, near the coast. The Japanese were obliged to retreat, and thanks to Allied bomber squadrons, were forced to move their aircraft to bases much further east, away from the front line, making them less effective. The main Japanese military offensive actively moved some 400 miles further north to Manipur State and Nagaland, with a specific target of the Lion Box, a 1 mile by 1.5 mile ordnance depot situated on the Imphal plain. Lion Box was full of supplies which the Japanese had become dependent upon. They needed to capture the facilities at Imphal and, via Kohima, Dimapur. 117 Squadron and 194 Squadron, alongside USAF Troop Carrier Command, with elements of the other Dakota units, were maintaining the supply line to Wingate's columns and supporting units in retreat in their defined defensive stages. They were holding back an enormous force of 100,000 fighting men, advancing in a three-pronged attack.
The 33rd Japanese Division attacked from the south, coming up towards Imphal, was the 15th Division, came across the middle with the Indian Nationalist Army to attack this road between Imphal and Kohima, but also the Lion Box, which was a large ordnance depot, and therefore used the stores that were there.
The third element, the 31st Japanese Division, to the north, attacked with its 30,000 strong fighting force, determined to overrun Kohima and then move on to Dimapur, its railhead, and a mountain-free progression south to Delhi. However, the tide was turning. The aircraft became dispersed around the airfields, making the refuelling and maintenance more arduous and time-consuming, but safer in an air attack. These were busy times. Loads of up to 7,500 pounds, which is 3.5 tons, were not uncommon for routine, long-distance supply flights. Senior aircraftmen Bill Smart and Jack Galt were just two of the 31 Squadron flight coordinating team. I knew Bill and Jack very well. They were both coordinators on the squadron, working from a small shed just out at the end of the squadron precinct. They were both subject to the Official Secrets Act, working as they did with aircraft supply dropping to the Chindits in the remote parts of Burma, and obviously not wishing to let Japanese intelligence know anything about the proposed routes. They spent hours each day in direct communication with the aircraft in flight, coordinating the supply chain to Chindit columns on the move behind Japanese lines, and of course our defending forces who were exercising a strategic retreat. The DZ locations moved for many reasons during the course of a 1 to 3 hour outward flight to a drop. It is important to understand that the RAF squadron was an integrated entity. Suppliers, clerks, police, medics and aircraft engineers with their aircrews made them autonomous units. Allied troops retreated into the Kohima complex and set up the defensive arrangements, which were thankfully adapted to a higher standard by the West Kents when they arrived from their rest and recuperation after defending in the Arakan. Many different units were involved, roughly 1,500 fighting and 1,500 non-combatant troops. It is what happened next that forms the focus of the supply operation to that area. The road from Dimapur had been cut, which meant that the Japanese had closed every land route into Kohima, effectively denying any land-orientated supply. Now, this was a battle of 30,000 Japanese, a fighting force of fearless individuals that had an even more desperate logistical supply problem in maintaining their soldiers. They pitched their strength against the Kohima complex of fighters on an array of topographically high points and an airborne supply system. Thanks to the Arakan experience, most of our flights in and out of Kohima were free of any interference. Air superiority was ours. The revived air combat capability provided by Indian Air Force fighter, reconnaissance and ground attack squadrons was a real boon, and their crews enthusiastically assisted the RAF and American Air Forces. The wide-ranging Allied squadrons were now working from well over 150 airfields, most of which had been constructed during the monsoon season in 1943. That enabled us to put forward a superior force to the Japanese and force them back down into the eastern area of Burma. Whilst vigilance was important, interference with air supply missions from air attack became less of a problem. Wingate's plan to establish bases behind enemy lines for a second time with the 77th Indian Brigade had progressed on the 5th of March with Operation Thursday. Once more, Brigadier General Auld was in the driving seat piloting the 1st Dakota to land on the airstrip, constructed in a couple of days to be known as Broadway. On the map of the central Burma area, you will hopefully note the crosshatch area. It's deliberately faint, which indicates the broad area of Chindid activity and air supply requirements into jungle, dense, unforgiving jungle. This is mosquito, malaria territory. A constant stream of aircraft, most often at night, brought in supplies, troops, construction equipment, jeeps, anti-aircraft guns, mules, and all that went with it. 2,000 troops became 9,000 that needed sustaining, and the environment was going to grow as White City near Malu, Piccadilly, Aberdeen, Chowringhee all became established. The runways were thermometer-shaped, landing towards the bulb before unloading and loading, then taking off in the opposite direction. It was not without hazard, as some aircrew recall. An aircraft landing in the opposite direction could have been fatal. The noise of its engines was heard as it passed overhead. By late March, the situation was predictable. More aircraft were needed. On the 13th of April, Imphal and Kohima were given air supply priority by Brigadier General Slim. Pressure on the 4 RAF units increased to an unsustainable level. However, it was acknowledged that action was urgent to address the situation. This was verified at a conference headed by Lord Louis Mountbatten, requesting 100 more aircraft on loan for a month. They were provided from USAF's resources. In the event, they were retained under duress, of course, for almost 2 months, despite pressure to release them. The Dakota aircraft came from the Middle East and a few from the Hump as part of the newly formed Combined Army Air Transport Organisation. Priority was directed to Kohima and Imphal. The area surrounding Imphal and Kohima is best appreciated by this map of the Imphal Plain. The only way into the area was over mountainous jungle from almost any direction. This was difficult terrain to fly in. An initial attempt to supply the beleaguered troops at Kohima went horribly awry. We can note the geographic position north of Imphal from Agatala on the map. Failure to supply was not an option. On the 13th of April, the initial drop was arranged. The multiple aircraft delivered their bountiful load directly to the Japanese. The response within the command structure was immediate. Experience and ability were required. As a result, 8 194 Squadron Dakotas and their crews were seconded on detachment to 31 Squadron's command under the leadership of Wing Commander Bill Burberry. Burberry was tasked with the exclusive duty of providing the necessary drops to the correct location. The troops defending Kohima. This is a copy of Wing Commander Burberry's official record of events. On the 14th of April, 10 aircraft, led by Wing Commander Burberry and his crew, made between 8 and 10 circuits by each aircraft to drop the required supplies. When he completed his circuits, Burberry then climbed above the action to take a view from above. It was judged and later confirmed as a complete success. 25 tons delivered on target under intense ground fire. That marked the start of a piece of military aviation excellence that has not been surpassed since. It was heroism in the extreme, both on the ground and in the air, under constant enemy fire. However, as Burberry notes, the Dakota had become a little more aggressive in its approach. The defenceless Dakota became a fighting machine with the fitting of 2 Vickers machine guns amidships, one in either emergency exit panel on the port and starboard side of the aircraft. Each aircraft had 2 WOP-AG, wireless operator air gunner, crew members, as a surprise package from any attacking Zero or Oscar aircraft that thought the Dakota was an easy target, which many did over central Burma. Not at Kohima though. Ground-based rifle and mortar fire was what these aircraft and crews had to endure on every one of their 8 to 10 delivery passes. The Vickers machine guns were used to strafe the Japanese soldiers on the ground. They could easily be seen from the 150-foot vantage point on a non-stop gun-firing path, which apparently was enough to convince the Japanese soldiers to keep their heads down. It probably created a few casualties along the way. However, we were not without our own casualties. Squadron Leader Pauls from HQ in Delhi requested a visit to fly in a Dakota with 31 Squadron. George Donaldson, a pilot of a 194 lone aircraft, agreed to take him on over Kohima as a kicker.
He received a bullet in the backside as a memento of this mission that he volunteered for. Many were not as fortunate as the inquisitive squadron leader. The remains of aircraft litter the countryside, and many of those bodies of aircrew have never been recovered. But those that were are in the cemetery near that tennis court in the centre of Kohima, along with their army colleagues.
As you might appreciate, the load content was far from random. Rations were strictly administered. Different cultures required differing supplies. The British Tommies' needs are compared here to the Rajput, Assam Rifles and Punjabi regiments, personnel who were surrounded at Kohima. There was the West African Regiment in the Arakan, of course, moving into Burma, and the East African Regiment elsewhere. The Allies were a diverse fighting force with differing needs, including munitions and hardware. The following three extracts from 31 Squadron CO's logbook are included to illustrate the tremendous diversity and extreme workload of these aviators and their ground staff. Kohima became the focal point of accurate airdrops in a siege that lasted almost a month before relieving forces were able to break through the Japanese lines with relief supplies along the road from Dimapur and provide replacement troops for the West Kents, Royal Norfolks, Assam Rifles, Rajput and Punjabi and other incumbent soldiers. This and other contemporary logbooks reveals the activity and its variance before and after Kohima. You can see that the destinations vary daily in a full flying program. From the 14th of April, the focus is directed solely at Kohima. The aircrew logbooks show flights in early May to be daily drops to Kohima from the 3rd to the 9th, at which point Kohima's beleaguered units were relieved. The day ground force relief arrived is very apparent. From the point that the road into Kohima was passable, the aircraft and crews were busy virtually every day through to mid-June, supporting the Allied offensive with conventional drops to the east continuing over the Burma border. Lining up for the drop has many facets. The dropping procedure is precision work. Maintaining airspeed is fundamental. Do not stall the aircraft. Ground speed is critical. The slower the better. A headwind ideal, but of course that influences parachute drops, in particular 2 to 3 shoots in any pass. At 75 miles an hour, an aircraft covers 150 feet in a second. There are 8 to 10 items to kick out per pass, assuming a maximum 6 seconds over the drop zone. Flying at 150 to 250 feet with the enemy shooting at the aircraft. Rifle and mortar fire, much of it from above the flight path. We should ask, how did the aircraft get to the DZ and home again?
The key person is the navigator, who did a marvellous job within the aircraft on maths, pure maths, and no GPS, no peculiar radio waves, just him and a Dalton computer, which was a bit like a slide rule. I know you're not old enough to remember a slide rule, but it's a very simple piece of calculating equipment and worked very, very well. They had to determine the wind speed, the wind direction, coupled with the aircraft speed, and of course which way the aircraft was pointing at any particular time. It wasn't easy. These were very clever and dedicated individuals. The amount of cumulus cloud that could rise to 10,000 feet and he had to fly through was an impediment to the navigator, because with his periscope he couldn't see the ground beneath the aircraft. And of course the topography meant that the ground could suddenly come up, and if he got his calculations wrong, that could be fatal. These were men who directed a Dakota aircraft to a drop zone often the size of a suburban garden. And then, of course, they were tasked with getting the aircraft and the crew safely back to base.
Mind your heads proved to be an important warning. First, mark the drop area. Stay clear, then retrieve. Not always easy under fire. A string of aircraft in circuit can and did pose a hazard to the over-enthusiastic recovery teams, particularly from a misguided, free-falling parcel from above. A defined drop zone was preferred, with a parachute cloth central line clearly laid out for the pilot to see. The drop materials, including live goats in wooden crates and such like, dropped to the left of the line. All recovery personnel would be to the right and stay clear. At Kohima, Japanese snipers were a clear hazard during the flight over the zone for the aircrew and their aircraft, but even more so for the recovery personnel on the DZ. Those materials then had to be collected. 10 aircraft indicates 25 tons of water. Bear in mind the enemy had cut our water supply. Food, equipment and material that had to be sorted, logged and distributed to the correct recipients. Every pack was marked with the intended user and contents. Many items were triple packed, jute bags. The first bag would be expected to burst, the second to sustain damage, and the third to remain intact for free drop dispatches. These are the defence positions on the 4th of April 1944. The garrison was on a series of knolls, hills, each having its own activity and store and a unit attaching to it. Each was initially defended and supplied as an entity. It was a precise and dangerous task, strategically retreating northwards. Now, this is the same slide viewed towards the east to gain perspective. As you can see, the Dimapur to Imphal road comes up from the west and doubles back around the point to then run south to Imphal, off to the right. Just as the topography determines that route, it also affects the flight path and drop zone. We turn here to a sideways view. You can see the knolls, the hills that comprise the military camp. In profile, the lie of the land becomes clearer. We are looking from Punjab Ridge over the Dimapur section of the road towards the steep incline of Picket Hill in the centre, and the relevant heights of the hills sequence on each side. The Japanese had an overall view of the final battleground as our defence perimeter moved north, that's left, towards the tennis court and the bend in the road, which was the ultimate defensive boundary. This is my visual interpretation of the changes over time from the 13th of April, when the first airborne drop was made mistakenly onto Transport Ridge, on the right, held by the Japanese. The battlefield had shrunk over time as the defenders pulled back towards Garrison Hill, the hospital, and garrison headquarters to the left, that's north. The area of the available drop zone reduces until the 14th of May, when the dark green line depicting the boundary perimeter of the defending troops to the left of the illustration was finally relieved by ground forces and the Japanese dislodged.
Every hill had to be retaken and the adjacent road made available for the incoming Allied troops to use, albeit under constant fire from the departing Japanese on their hilltop vantage points. This is an overview of the Imphal-Dimapur road as it rounds the hillside, travelling in a northeasterly direction to turn almost due west. The view is like a pointed nose. A probable flight path is indicated. A significant failing, which many documentaries highlight when outlining proposed or actual troop movements in this area and related areas, and the impediment to a workable strategy in the Kohima ground campaign, was a lack of understanding of the severe nature of the change in topography of the battlefield or the composition of the terrain being negotiated. It was not until the senior officers arrived in this theatre that often their appreciation of the scale of the impediments to traverse the peaks grew and revised their strategic thinking. They should perhaps have talked to the men on the march and the aviators endeavouring to supply them. Here we see a probable approach to the DZ on Garrison Hill in order to optimise the length of the drop zone and therefore the time over the target to get those 8 to 10 bundles kicked out of the aeroplane for an accurate drop to the troops below. This was the site of the deciding battleground and the infamous tennis court. The rout of the Japanese was due to the supply chain that had been established by the Allied air forces. The Japanese had no equivalent mechanism to nurture their troops. Their troops were in fact starving. The Kohima siege was lifted and the fresh troops pursued the enemy eastwards. The Dakotas that were on loan returned to action in the Middle East. Fresh Canadian squadrons joined the transport supply network in Southeast Asia, which was once more detailed to supply our advancing troops in the field as they moved out of northeast India and the Assam into Burma, over the Chindwin River, the Irrawaddy, and down to Rangoon. The extraordinary group of men that made up the Dakota squadrons and other notable units were removed from the front line for a well-earned rest. 31 Squadron retired to northwest India in a short rest and training for paradropping and glider towing in preparation for the final push from Rangoon. However, 31 Squadron was soon back in action, operating from Ramri Island, supply dropping again. There was a war to be won. Basel was an airfield well known to Wing Commander Burberry. Basel provided a point where he could finally relish his well-deserved American Distinguished Flying Cross and hand over command of his squadron to a fresh blood from June 1944. The Dakota aircraft were at the business end of the supply chain. We've mentioned non-combatants. However, it's a fact that those in charge of ordnance supply very often had to fight. Not quite in the same way as someone with a rifle has to fight, but nevertheless fight it is, to get the appropriate equipment, tools, ammunition, food, or whatever comprised the task at hand to the person that requested it through the supply channel at every level. In this case, the Indian Army Ordnance Regiment at places like Agartala and Camilla, railheads, Dimapur, and of course further away, Dum Dum, Calcutta airfield, and the ports where supplies were unloaded, were exercising their skills and efficiency. It is pertinent to note that Lummy Lord is the only Transport Command VC from any RAF theatre of operation. Now Lummy cut his aviation teeth on 31 Squadron. He'd gained his considerable skill and empathy with his task operating in northeast India and central Burma. He worked where Chindits were engaged in operations behind enemy lines, disrupting Japanese supply channels. He flew supplies to defending and then attacking combat units. Even more so at Kohima, he could almost touch the extreme conditions and the fortitude of the troops that his crew were dropping supplies to.
Perhaps you will have noted many acts of valour during this presentation. The following poem is written by a man in combat and is appropriate, I think, at this point. Where would the Army and the Air Force be without the Douglas DC-3? As a maid of work, it's always there, on spindly legs with snooty nose up in the air. The Pratt & Whitney engines, sometimes a difficult rating, needs careful skill on takeoff and careful calculating, with canvas seats to carry troops or bales of cargo secured in loops.
Rations, ammo, fodder and mules, all were part of its flying schedules. They pick up salvaged aircraft, bring in all the mail, and return to Agatala via a cloud-filled trail. They carry, neath the fuselage, a vital spare main plane for another DAC or Spit or shot-up Hurricane. They fly unescorted sorties, trying to find a small DZ, and circle lower and lower to ensure the Japs aren't fed. They zoom in low over Imphal Plain almost every day, hoping to avoid the others, taking off the other way. There's 31 from Agatala, the first in the Indian skies, who, along with 62, make sure we get supplies. The friendly firm of 194, along with 117, are but some of the DACs that fly the Burmese heaven. So, although they haven't the glamour or the power of a fighter's motor, we'd certainly be in trouble without the old Dakota. This is Garrison Hill today. It is a graveyard. Among the soldiers are the airmen who died, all of whom gave their todays for our tomorrows. Yes, this is where that phrase was coined. Your generosity will be modest in comparison to theirs. Through your generosity we can give meaning to the tomorrows of the descendants of the Nagas who also gave so much in support of the Allies. It is a contrasting view of Kohima in 1944 from the diorama of the Kohima Museum and of course the war cemetery in that same site today. By the end of 1944 there were 255 Allied airfields in India supplied by way of the Indian Army Ordnance Regiment. Now that regiment provided the resources from which they could create the loads for the Dakotas. Some of their duties included recovering and repairing parachutes from the front line. A reported 10% of all textile manufacturing in India was devoted to parachutes. In summary, over 1,200 hours of intensive flying per aircrew person was the tally. Probably 12 to 16-hour servicing shifts on a 7-day working week for most of the ground crew to keep the aircraft serviceable, quite apart from the occasional excursion as a kicker, which was expected and delivered. It was quite a task, and one which is owed a great debt of gratitude. Here is a small group of veterans and representatives at the Kohima Educational Trust annual gathering at York Minster for a remembrance service in July 2019. The man front and centre with the green beret is John Giddings, MBE, who was a kicker for 3 weeks on 31 Squadron over Kohima. John was a mechanic on 17 Squadron in Ceylon, servicing Spitfires when he noticed a request for volunteers for hazardous operations in routine orders. He volunteered, and after a rail journey from the bottom of India to the very top, he joined 31 Squadron at Agatala. He had volunteered to spend 3 weeks on his back over Kohima, kicking 56 to 110-pound packs out of an unspecified aircraft to an unknown recipient below.
John was 98 years of age when the photograph was taken. He was chairman of the Burma Star Association, which sadly has closed down through diminishing membership. Above and behind John is the irrepressible Naga representative. What would we have done without their unstinting assistance? This is Dr. Noogli. We must remember them all. They gave so much. The book shown here, for reference, give reverence to those memories. Thank you for viewing this blow-by-blow Life Publications Limited presentation. If you've enjoyed the production, perhaps you would like to donate to the Kohima Educational Trust's work. Donations can be made on the KET website, www.kohimaeducationaltrust.net. Donations to the Kohima Educational Trust, which does such sterling work with the schooling and education of the younger generation of Naga people who gave so much to assist our troops in the Burma campaign, can be made direct in this final frame. Thank you in anticipation of your generosity. Now, this presentation has been made possible by the perseverance and resources of historian and trustee of the Kohima Educational Trust, Dr. Robert Lyman, together with administrator of KET, Sylvia May, and not forgetting the archiving and resourcing of 31 Squadron RAF Association, the artistic talents of Linda O'Halloran, and of course the technical skills of Andy Blow. Thank you very much for your interest. Bye-bye.